One point that I'm curious about is that in the group that I work with, the New Economy Coalition, part of the way of getting buy-in and building relationships and getting alignment is trying to inject some form of democratic practice. That is electing some members of our board and having elections or kinds of elections for what our focus should be. And I'm curious about whether what you've learned, because introducing democratic process has many advantages and also introduces a whole range of other complications. And I'm wondering if you found that, what you have found about that in thinking through collective impact organizations.
So I'll have some thoughts, but you're ready to rock and roll. So I'm going to let you answer it, and then I'll introduce you guys too. But well, I'm just going to go to you because I don't know exactly what my answer would be until I figure it out.
Good.
So here we have Sterling Speirn. For those, let me just give you a quick introduction, Sterling. I know you need no introduction,
Please, let's just jump in.
Here are probably two of the smartest people I know in the sector. Every time they're in the room, the IQ goes up about 300%, and Sterling is certainly one of them. And Sterling is a longtime, just past immediate president of the Kellogg Foundation. And he's got a really cool initiative, which hopefully we can talk about, called Poverty Interrupted, which is asking the question: can we, how can we do it? How much does it cost to actually interrupt the intergenerational transfer of poverty? And then here we have Karen Pittman. Karen has devoted her life to youth development. She is co-founder and currently runs, along with Marita Irby, the Forum for Youth Investment. I could read you all her impressive accomplishments, but that would just all make us really like, wow, you know. But suffice to say, just wonderful. And let's just leap right into it.
Karen and I practiced flying like birds earlier this morning.
We did.
While John was talking and thinking about one of the themes of the conference has been this constant vigilance, you know, these new sensing mechanisms our communities need to have. And on my way to interviewing with the search committee for the CEO position of NPR a few months ago, a job I did not get and probably shouldn't have gotten, I was cramming about everything about journalism and new technologies and how the world was changing. And I had this epiphany sitting here that, you know, what we've seen from the crowdsourcing, mass awareness, blogs, the kinds of digital connections people made during the Arab Spring, and how that technology would be perfect for supporting the little data systems in our communities that are doing collective impact. And I'm blanking on the author's name, and it was a fabulous book on mass awareness and this fabulous crowdsourcing of do-it-yourself solutions, where non-professionals, ordinary people in the community, are asked a question. It goes out to a network, but in our communities we could say, we want everybody thinking about this issue, or today it's this issue. And amateurs, you know, non-specialists have shown on the web, and Prize Philanthropy has shown this too, they have amazing insights and innovative ideas that we specialists and experts, we only have a certain bandwidth because our cognition starts to go down certain tunnels. I saw it in Prize Philanthropy. Peter Diamandis created an X Prize for getting oil out of water. He realized that since the Exxon Valdez spill, the technology of removing oil from water before the BP experience had not improved one bit. So they put out an X Prize, $1 million, better technology to remove oil from water. A guy from Las Vegas who was in the pool business was a finalist for figuring out the solution to that. And I'm thinking collective impact, we need to do just what that do-it-yourselfers, crowdsourcing, mass awareness, and blogging that is community-based. We're not searching the world for these answers. We're searching our communities. And I think we just need to take that technology, and now our young digital natives or others, they're going to be the ones that drive that, I think, into our communities.
So I can see that with you know, solutions and contributions to how we actually address particular issues. Could you see that with governance too? Because I think that was Bob's question.
Well, I was trying to take democracy from everybody can contribute versus everybody can govern. I think I think as that came up a few days ago when Patrick started about, well, there's tensions between advisory boards, the governing. It's clear that some of that, if you can suspend I had the awareness there's no Big Bang theory of collective impact. It doesn't all just start the way the universe did and everything happens as a result. We heard you sort of stumble or find your way to it. And I think governance also has to be flexible enough that there has to be co-creation in that ultimate governance structure without alienating half the people when it's announced at the first day that these people are sitting on some particular board.
Karen, what are your thoughts on that?
I think you can start, there are a couple of words that we use a lot that we need to reconsider. One is governance. I mean, what does that mean? That may be an old word that we need to replace. Because is the goal to govern, or is the goal actually to take what comes out of this collective process and be ultimately accountable for acting on it? So your collective seeing, collective learning, collective action, if it goes that way, if we want the masses to do the collective seeing, if we want to bring that together in a way that we get collective learning, and then that pushes up to collective action, you want that governing group to be responsible for making sure that that action happens. But too often governing feels top down, so I would challenge that word. The other one I've heard the phrase a lot over the past couple of days, and it just struck me as Rich was talking yesterday. We talk about getting everybody at the table, and I think we actually need to just think it's about multiple tables.
Yep.
I mean, emergence is about when you try to get everybody at the table, and our simple way of doing democracy is sort of a Noah's Ark approach. We need 2 parents and 2 young people and we bring them to the table, but they're not empowered with the same tools. They're representing other organized tables. And so all you're doing is bringing a power imbalance together. We feel better that we got more people to the table, but that's not democracy, and that's actually not really helping governance. So we can talk more about ways to do that, but I think even talking about the goal is at the table, the goal is what Sterling just described. How do you get collective seeing, collective learning, collective action? I'm not sure it's about cramming everybody to the same table. It's about creating multiple tables and making sure that we're empowering them. We heard some good examples of that yesterday.
And I think that's a really important point to make. This is the art of collective impact is, it's not like getting everybody in the room at the same time, but figuring out as things emerge, who can really contribute a much better way of thinking about it.
And John, you told the story yesterday, it's going to their tables. Yes, exactly. When you said the adoption of some innovations isn't because it made sense and it was evidence-based, it's because that person cared about me.
Right.
They built a relationship, and then all this stuff they're talking about, and I thought that's where you're going with permaculture. Why did these farmers adopt it?
Yeah.
It's like, they don't just say, oh, thank you for that idea, I'll go change.
Right.
And I think you go out to their tables and you sit in their homes, in their communities. I think the way Boston Rising did, just go out on the street and ask people if you can talk to them. Don't get them in a focus group. Don't ask them to come to your offices. Be out there. When Paul said, hire someone from every zip code, you have to be there, not have them here.
Yeah, and I know Liz Weaver is in Canada with Tamarack, leads up this really powerful initiative. I think, Liz, you're up to like 40 cities or 50 cities, vibrant communities, and it's around poverty reduction. And I think that's one of the things that you all have done really well is you've gone into the communities, you've done this work with your, and it's not, exactly as you said, Sterling, really great. Great.
I mean, one of the questions when we had the small group discussions yesterday in the evaluation session, and one of the questions that came up, which is very common, is, all right, so we know we have to sort of get people to the table. So we do this big forum, and 200, 300, 500 people come together for a day or two and put things on the wall and have ideas, but we don't know how to sustain that. So what happens to those? What happens to that engagement when those folks go away? And out here somewhere is a colleague that was sitting with me from Alaska, and he said, so we tried that, and that didn't work. I mean, we realized that we didn't get the sustained engagement. So if it's not just bring people in and be inclusive for a day, but figure out how they're going to be inclusive throughout the entire process, they realized that their dollars were much better spent, just as Sterling said, in each of those little rural communities, have someone from that community who's actually paid to create those tables, so that when you want to find out what's going on, you've got the person who's been naturally sort of organizing that table. When you bring them together, you get a very different kind of, you get a very different kind of experience than if you had just brought them together into this kind of a room for 2 days. So thinking about how we actually, sort of build capacity out, building multiple tables, and then, like your birds, when you want them to sort of move together, they can move together with much more power.
And John, I thought when you started your talk this morning about asking the fundamental question, how does social change happen? And I've heard many conversations with colleagues in the room about our board doesn't get it, or they're from the business world. And I would just say to them, well, okay, how does the business world make change? How do markets drive change? We should appreciate and understand that, but we also ought to say, we don't have the invisible hand that Adam Smith talked about in our communities. Much of the frustration we're all experiencing is we're all doing good work. Nothing invisibly connects it all to drive markets and maximize good. So to our boards, we have to say, so how do you think? So they have to answer that question too. And then we have to tell stories like Paul did on Rosa Parks to say, well, let me give you 3 stories on how social change happened to sort of draw them into our world of not just technical complexity, but how do we say to our boards that Rich and Stacy and Junior's talked about, about having hope and belief and some belief that that we could change the world. And I think we have to get them to answer that question, because if not, they will continue to be frustrated by no short-term outcomes. And as you said, you can't start with, let me explain collective impact. I think you have to ask them to answer the question first.
That's great. Thanks. Other questions? Thoughts? Back there? Yeah.
Yeah.
But I have one. Thank you. Yesterday in one of the breakouts, I offered a definition of quality, and that is that quality is the customer's perception of value. And we're a community foundation. We regard donors as customers. And I have not heard the word donor once in 3 days. Why are we turning our back on that community?
I don't think anybody up here I don't think anybody in this room is turning our back on donors. I think it's the same conversation. Having come from a community foundation too, I found talking with a brand new donor who was a blank slate, had no great opinions on how social change happens. They'd never thought about it before. You have a chance to imprint, as an infant does with their parent, to say, well, let me tell you how we think about it. And I've had donors make $1 million gifts in initiatives in the community because I said, this is how we think it happens. So no, I don't think anybody's turning their back on donors. And in fact, if anything, it might be new donors and the new billionaires. They may think that technology solves every problem with a silver bullet. But I think as soon as they wade into complex problems, they too say, wow, we need to sit with all of you. I also think there's hope for we aging boomers. Because if we remember Thomas Kuhn's in the Structure of Scientific Revolutions, it was the old timers in a discipline that's been repeated over these 3 days who are frustrated that the current way of working and the current way we understand the universe or this science isn't working. What we don't have is what 3M had, is how does collective impact give a community that sensing? So the famous story about the Post-it, because 3M always met once a week and all the scientists shared their problems and failures. And this guy said, I made this glue, but it didn't stick very well. And this other person, I think it was even a secretary or something, who said, that's perfect for something I can put on and take off easily. Because they had they had a group of people that all thought about this stuff. How do we take that individual frustration into a room and other people say, you just gave me the answer to my problem? That's a trick, because our meetings are where they're always, they're tactical, they're getting the job done. They're not like we're sitting in a room talking about what happened this week.
Yeah, I think what donors care about, those that want to get engaged, they care about results, right? That's value that I think most of the donors that I hear about. We work with a lot of community foundations and high net worth individuals. They're looking for results, but I think a lot of folks, in the high net worth world have not spent a lot of time really thinking about how social change happens. And when you do, you develop a fundamentally different perspective on the world. A community that I am really super impressed by is the Social Venture Partners Network. Anybody here from SVP? Mm-hmm. Okay, so SVP started Social Venture Partners. It's wealthy individuals who are getting together to pool their capital and to, importantly, provide their sweat equity to support communities and to support nonprofits, et cetera. And they came about as a result that they were right at the front of the venture philanthropy movement. And I think the venture philanthropy movement, it was interesting. It went poof, and then it went like that. But there are some people who stuck around, who said, I'm going to do the hard work of really figuring out how social change happens. And those folks stayed in Social Venture Partners, and then they built on that. And they've taken collective action, but they believe in the principles of collective impact. That's like one of the 3 pillars that they're trying to spread throughout their network. So there's a set of people. So I think at the end of the day, donors want results. But you have to wade into this stuff to really understand that results isn't the dashboard moving on a quarterly basis. And I think that's often what donors want. And donors for community foundations, for example. And I don't think they're ill-meaning. They just don't really understand that this stuff doesn't move on a quarterly basis. And looking at the end outcome indicators isn't necessarily the best way to characterize results in a quarterly, an annual, or even a biannual basis. There's a question over here. Yes, right here. Will you get the mic there?
So I have two questions. One that kind of expounds on the question about the donor. Coming from a community foundation, what I find is that donor is more than one audience. It could be those that volunteer their time, and it could also be those that are service providers that also give to the United Way. So a really good example is several of the nonprofits that receive grants from United Way are some of our biggest givers. Some of the history will show you that many givers are from lower income populations and are also receiving some of the benefits that they're contributing to. And so when we think about donors from the community perspective, it is such a mix, and it's that healthy tension between some of our wealthier donors and some of our more grassroots donors that just really may have a tie to the organization because of something that they really love. And so having that balance and understanding that they are customers, but so are the people that are being served by the dollars that are donated, and understanding that they're both a customer looking for a certain kind of quality of life in the service that comes out of those foundations. And so it's a really important thing to look at it as more than just one customer. The customer is so diverse. And then my question is really around the credit game. So when we're working collectively, there are many interests, many groups that want credit for their participation or want to be able to brand their piece of this work. And sometimes that creates some serious challenges for us. I don't know if others are experiencing the similar challenges around branding and around ownership. Give us maybe some suggestions on how to navigate that without discrediting those that are participating in the collaboratives, so that we still look like one voice and one message, but we're encompassing the many components of who's contributing to whatever initiative we're doing in collective impact.
Yeah.
Great.
Well, I'll jump in. So I think you ended with the right word, that the shift is from attribution to contribution. But the thing that when we talk about collaboratives, one of the things that happens, and everyone knows this, is that if you've just got a loose collaborative structure where a lot of names on the list and some general things, when whatever you were trying to do, when the number goes well, when it goes in the right direction, everybody takes credit. When the number goes in the wrong direction, I didn't do it. It wasn't my, I had nothing to do with it. So the first thing that we have to do if we're really going to organize for collective impact is get very specific about how each of those partners are contributing. So that takes a lot of time. That's a new behavior. And so, John, you said a couple times you should throw out logic models. We actually like logic models, but I like them because we push them further. So rather than spending all of your time over here focusing on what do we think the strategies are that are going to get the needle to move on the outcome we care about, you back up from that, whether it's 10 interventions or whatever that we think we need to have, early childhood education, et cetera, you back up to say, what are the things that have to change to get that? What is it that the various partners, your story, what is it the various partners around the table have that actually could help make that change happen? Can they influence policy? Can they organize parents? What can they do? If they name the contribution that they think is in their wheelhouse to be able to do, write it down on a piece of paper, put it up on a wall, they don't get to count the whole thing, but they can be given credit for that contribution. But again, only if all of them working together move the thing. So if your goal was, we're going to expand early childhood education, and I've got a group around the table just like John's picture, and this person's going to work on the policy side, and these folks are going to organize parents, and we're going to train the daycare providers. Everybody's taken a role. Their roles are clear. Everybody agrees that all those roles are important, and that we need all of those things to happen in order to get it to move. That story is a powerful story. The contribution happens because the partners are named, their contributions are named, but the most important thing is the change happened.
I don't think there's anything fundamentally wrong with branding a program. For example, corporations, right? A lot of corporations brand programs. I think what's wrong about it is when they then assume that it's a certain solution that they branded that needs to happen in the community. We have Campbell Soup here in the audience, and they've really been an extraordinary leader in collective impact in the child obesity prevention area. And what I love about what they're doing is branded, but they're focused on the process. And they'll tell you that basically what our contribution is supporting and facilitating this structured process, not coming up with answers. So I don't think there's anything inherently wrong with branding. I do think there is something wrong with branded programs that assume you have the solution worked out in advance. And that's what, for you to have a brand around that and get credit with your constituencies, people have to implement your solution. I think that's a problem.
And I would push it on a little bit. I think it's not just you think you have the solution in advance. You talked about rules of interaction, and we need to have predetermined rules of interaction. There are lots of us, if we're in the change business, who actually have our own ways of thinking about how the interaction works. Who gets invited to the table? How long does the process take? Do we do a needs assessment first? If you're an organization that has some of those things already sort of predetermined, United Ways are in the room, lots of you all have ways of going about doing community problem solving. If it's a collective impact initiative and you really want the community to figure out what the rules of interaction are, either the group has to say, we want United Way to be branded. We want this to be a branded United Way initiative because we like those predetermined rules of interaction, or we've got to step back and give the group space to decide which way they want to do it. Do they want to use more of a community organizing approach? What rules of interaction make sense for helping them get where they want to go? We've certainly seen that be attention, because once an initiative is sort of owned by a particular organization that has a way of doing business, even if it's not so much we've got the solution, if we've got the methodology, and that methodology tends to include certain people or certain data, exclude certain people or certain data, there's an underlying tension there.
That's good. Thank you. Other questions over here?
So, John, I thought your presentation of complexity theory was brilliant, and I think sorely needed. One of the premises, from at least my memory of it from graduate school, was that when you're looking at complexity theory, you're looking at multiple outcomes coming out of a system. And I wonder if we're not looking at this whole question of success too narrowly. Like, for example, yesterday we had the education folks in one room, and then we had environment, and we had health. Are we overly narrowing our definitions of success? You know, if we say we're being asked by our funders to define it's the percentage of kids that go on to college, are we going to really find that to really increase the dials, that we're going to have to see improvements across a whole different, a wider swath of outcomes?
Great question.
Yeah, just as we all are coming to understand the social determinants of health, John referred to it earlier, there are the social determinants of education. And K-12 teachers say, I can't address all the other challenges in my students' lives, and until we do that as well as reform our schools, we won't get that kind of change. I think also a challenge, as Karen was saying, collective impact, not everybody needs to be aware of everything that's going on. If success is defined as we don't know the dimensions of success, we know we can't define the solutions ahead of time, and sometimes we can't even define the problem ahead of time, too narrowly. So what funders sit in a position to say, oh, I can be funding something over here, but I don't have to worry anybody else about. And if that turns up something I need, like a policy project that's actually focused on federal policy, well, people at the local community don't need to worry about that. At Kellogg, it was a great example of overnight. This is Silicon Valley. You know, it takes 20 years to be an overnight success. And if we could remind our donors and partners that that's the way it is, talk to anybody that built a business, they weren't successful based on the first business plan. Peter Sims has this wonderful book, Little Bets, where and it goes with Emergence. In the beginning of starting a company, you have to try a lot of stuff quickly, rapid, and fail. And, but it's not failing, it's learning. And in philanthropy, of course, we rarely get a chance to say, let us go out and try some stuff and learn. And then he says, after that emergence period, then you get more linear. Then you say, aha, this is working, let's build a logic model. But too quickly to define that doesn't work. At the W.K. Kellogg Foundation, we were doing food work and agricultural work in 1955. And we were doing food systems, for decades before childhood obesity hit the covers of Time magazine. And it's great to see all the things that the team did over the years, integrated farming and food systems. Like funders that are concerned about the ocean and fisheries, they realized we've got to go to the consumer and change the demand curve for the fish that is ruined, the way the fishing habits. In food, our food systems folks said, oh, we're trying to change farming practices. Now we have to go into cities and change food demand for this kind of food, long before childhood obesity. Though they said, well, so what are our barriers? They said the land-grant colleges are the belly of the beast for agribusiness. So they said, let's endow professorships at land-grant colleges in sustainable agriculture. That was heresy. They did that, so they had 3 or 4 initiatives over 20 years, and then Michelle Obama and President Obama's elected, and Michelle Obama says, I'm going to take on this issue. It was a food fellow of the Kellogg Foundation, that one of our grantees had food fellows, and it was a food fellow, this is Rosa Parks, who mounted an online campaign to get a garden on the White House. And that's what Michelle Obama was sort of like, oh, what a great idea, I guess I'll do that. It wasn't Rosa Parks saying, I'm not going to do this. It wasn't Michelle Obama saying, hey, how about a garden? It was 20 or 30 years. And now the notion of good food, not focused on childhood obesity, but the food we eat should be grown fairly, not exploiting farm workers. It should be healthy, it should be affordable, and it should be green. It should be done in sustainable. You get all 4 of those things together. So a lot of people miss, like now when kids say, I want better school food, well, the school food movement was 15 years in the making before childhood obesity, and we couldn't have predicted that, and we frankly don't like childhood obesity. It's like you blame the victim, the problem is overweight. No, the problem is a food system that's multifaceted, and so that's what's happening now, and it's exciting to say we couldn't have guessed that. Now that that's emerged, and many of our grantees suddenly felt like the USDA took all their knowledge assets and put it up on the government website, and they felt a little expropriated, and I said, that's what we call success.
Karen, I say what you're going to say, but maybe I'd love for you to comment Sasha's question, because I know Forum for Youth Investment, you guys think a lot about what I call colliding collective impact efforts, in communities, and you guys have done a lot of thinking, a lot of work around that. So I'd love to hear you talk
I would love to jump in on that. So the answer to your question of do we often focus too narrowly is yes, I remember, and we're in a room with funders. I remember that there was a focus movement about 5 years ago where foundations, were told you have to get in there and focus. You have to sort of zoom in, find that narrow thing. That's where you're going to make your investment because that's how you move. You move the needle by focusing. But we clearly do move the needle by focusing. But the question is, how do you organize for collective impact? And when you go into your average community of 150,000 people, because we do this all the time, even in the children and youth space, which is where we work, we find an average of 75, sometimes 100 different collaboratives, networks, initiatives focused on little focused problems because somebody told them you have to focus on childhood obesity, you have to focus on gang violence, you have to focus on teen pregnancy, you have to focus on school readiness. Folks are organized to focus to get impact. The challenge is that fragmentation of community effort actually makes it almost impossible to get collective impact. So in at least the child and youth space, and this can apply in other places, we're convinced that the only way you're going to actually get collective impact to move the multiple needles on the indicators that folks are passionate about is to create a superstructure, which starts with figuring out who all those initiatives are. I'm not talking about direct service programs. I'm talking about task forces, initiatives, all work groups, things that have been created to try to come up with a solution to a problem and organize people and resources to get to that solution. They know each other exist. And it's sort of, if you think of this as a pool table, if you have a pool table with sort of soft, squishy, sort of, what are those, koosh balls or whatever they're called on it, they can bump into each other and they don't hurt. So these collaborators mostly know that they exist and they bump into each other politely and wave and maybe pass things back and forth and work together every now and then. But if collective impact is really bringing in sort of you're really increasing the capacity and the robustness of these partnerships to actually have an impact. Now you're talking about pool balls, and when they whack into each other, they hurt. And so we've seen bruised, collaborators that are bruised because they're now battling. They're hitting each other. They're competing to be the backbone for the initiative that they think their funding community is going to name, and everybody's jockeying to get into space. The only way that we really can solve this problem is by putting up a wall like that in the back that's too big for anybody to own. And for children and youth, it's really the idea that we're going to invest in young people from little to big, cradle to career, morning to night, in all the settings where they spend time, and across the range of outcomes that we know they need to actually, be successful in order to be ready for college, work, and life, or whatever phrase you want to use. That's a big job that everybody's taken a little piece of. Giving them the tools to see how everything that they've decided to do overlaps becomes sort of invigorating. The competition doesn't go away, but rather than everybody sort of jockeying to see who's going to get selected, when you can actually really give people visual pictures of the inefficiency of working in these small collaboratives. They have overlapping members, they're overlapping organizations, overlapping members, overlapping indicators, overlapping strategies, overlapping funders. There's just an incredible amount of inefficiency that we tolerate. And that allows us to really, that fragmentation really allows us to be complacent about goals. I can't tell you how many communities we go into. Marita's out there with me. We bring in any kind of data. We bring in the data, the Gallup student poll data. Less than 4 out of 10 young people in our public schools, 5th through 12th grade, are hopeful, engaged, and thriving. Less than 4 out of 10. So whatever goal you have, whether you want them to not be pregnant or you want them to learn STEM skills, the likelihood that they're going to do that is immediately eroded because they're not hopeful, they're not engaged in learning, and they're not thriving in some basic way. So when you put that kind of big, audacious goal in front of folks, which is really what we want our young people to be successful, we want them to be hopeful, we want them to be engaged, we want them to have a sense of thriving and well-being so that they can go on and accomplish what they want to accomplish. Everybody has a little piece of that. When we really give folks the tools then, like that wall in the back, to sit down in small groups, take one of those issues, let's say obesity, really push back to say, what are the root causes that are why that's there? What we find is that when they come up to that wall and put the answers up, the solutions are usually not the solutions that those individual collaborators are working on. Because they're going to work on the one that seems to be mostly closely identified with the problem. You want me to address dropout prevention? I'm going to get tutors to come in and help young people. That may not be the root cause of why young people are leaving school, but I can name that and tell it to my board, and it sounds like a good strategy. And what we found is it's very easy to get folks to really let go of strategies that on the surface feel like they're the right ones, but they are not addressing the root cause. Even when they know the root cause, in little collaboratives, they're going to say, that's too big for me to tackle. I can't tackle housing. I can't tackle transportation. I can't tackle homelessness and young people moving from one school to another, and that's the reason. But when that issue comes up across 5 or 6 different groups, and the wall sort of shows that, oh, there it is, they reorganize, and that's this emergence thing. Those folks really literally reorganize from groups that were focused on predetermined solutions to groups who are now organized around things that have emerged. And when you keep that structure alive, for us, the first sign of success is when you've got those folks and they stay engaged, they are regrouping into groups that make sense for tackling problems. The first sign of success is that when a new problem or a new funding opportunity comes into the community, people don't go in a corner and hoard it. They bring it to the table. And they go, oh, let's put this up on the wall and see how we should solve that one. That, for us, is the first sign that we've actually literally changed the way people are doing business.
So we're going to have to wrap up. But first of all, so you answered the question I wanted to give you guys in closing. And I'm so glad we're videotaping this because, my question was going to be, and I think Karen gave us probably, a list of 7 things. We'll get it out to all of you. So how do we help people better understand how social change happens? Mm-hmm. And you're talking about how do we raise these questions, help them see the interconnectedness of it. just a wonderful series of things. And so thank you for sharing that. And we will, we'll get it down. It was really cool. So I'd love for you to close on that.
Well, I just want to come back to another theme that, and Karen just alluded to, an individual having hope. And if that's the, and Rich and many people have talked about, I think Gabriel Garcia Marquez just died, and everybody's talking about his magical realism. And Salman Rushdie wrote a great essay in the Times Book Review. Why are we attracted to J.K. Rowling's books and books that mix reality with something that seems mysterious or magical? And I think, in our communities, I think our communities too are like, it's not magic that our communities could be better. It's not an impossibility. But it takes sort of like, we need, and when Faye Hanley Brown talked about Einstein's definition of insanity at the beginning, it made me think of two of Einstein's other quotes, which was, intelligence is not characterized by knowledge, but imagination. And we can't solve today's problems using the thinking that created them. So when we go into collective impact, it's just not how smart we are at devising programs. It's what is the social imagination that we're we're infusing? Have people imagine and believe in a better world. We'll find the technical solutions once we have the belief and the imagination that we can do this. And that John Gardner actually wrote about this in his book on leadership in 1990, because he too worried that Americans had lost the belief they could solve problems. No problems were intractable. If you can get to the moon, you would think you could solve other problems. So as John said, astrophysicists would say, well, we'll get to the moon because that's not social science. That's a joke. Anyway, so I do think that while we go out, the collective in collective impact is the people. It is there, and it may turn out that social capital and the connections of people is the most fundamental resource that collective impact will mobilize in its pursuit of larger solutions.
Yeah. So thank you both for that. My last word, since we're all quoting Albert Einstein, is everything should be made as simple as possible, but not simpler. And that is the nature of this work. And so hopefully, if you haven't met Sterling or Karen, you know why I enjoy spending so much time with them. The two of you are, within the field, you combine strategic wisdom, heart, and boldness. And that's a very rare combination. So please join me in thanking Sterling and Karen.